else I hear? Well, I have this really, really cool slab of elm back here, and someone had written me and said, you should make a river table out of it. And I was like, that is a cool idea. But first, I better try it on something else before I try that big old river table. I read some stuff about epoxy resins and all that stuff and making river tables, and there's a few different ways to do it. So I had this board here and it was cracked, so I cut it, and my straight line, not so straight. Anywho, I thought I could do that and make it into like a little river cutting board or something. Although you don't want knives on it, so a little river tiny table there. So I also cleaned off the bark and sanded it some, not a whole lot. I also rigged this up. I have it on a piece of melamine, and my boards will fit in here like this. This one's a little snug. But I read that I should like line it with something, and someone recommended tape, like shipping tape. So I'm gonna try that. Hey, I'm gonna butt in right here and let you know that my footage for the rest of this table got corrupted. My SD card went out. Weird. So I ended up making another one, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what I learned while I was doing this. Putting the tape down was a really great idea because it gave a surface that the resin wouldn't stick to, but I wouldn't do it this way, going over the frame and then over the melamine and over the frame again. It just made the edges of the project not very smooth or flat. So I wouldn't do it this way again. Also, I rigged up this crazy way to clamp down the board so they wouldn't lift up from the resin. And I figured out a better way to do it on the next one, and you'll see that in a little bit. But this worked, but it was just tricky and awkward to set up. So I don't recommend doing it this way. Also, I was guesstimating on the measurements by eyeballing how much I put into each cup. I've seen others use scales to weigh the amounts or use a measuring cup for each, and I think those systems are way better. Okay, I've learned even something more in the last couple days while I've been making this video, and that is that you should never weigh. And that's because, well, unless the directions tell you to weigh, because the two different materials that you use, the resin and the hardener, they have different weights. And so if you go 1 to 1, it won't be correct. So you do it by measuring, unless it tells you to weigh. But if you end up doing it the way I did, I recommend getting a cup that is smooth on the inside, because these red cups that I had are bumpy. And so I couldn't get the resin to come out of the cup easily because I couldn't scrape it out. It was ridged. So I ended up buying some paper cups, and those worked a lot better. Also, I wonder about this resin that we bought because it says it's tabletop resin. So I'm thinking maybe this isn't the right resin to make for thick pours. And I know I can only pour 1/4 of an inch at a time, and then I can layer it on top. But still, maybe there's a better resin. So I need to look into that. Also, I've seen some people pour resin into the frame before they put their wood down. And I didn't want to have a resin layer on top of my wood at all, so I didn't do that. I just put the wood in, and then I put the resin into the reservoir. It still got underneath the wood, but that wasn't my intention. I just wanted the bottom to be wood. What I also learned is if I wanted my bottom to be super smooth, that my surface that I'm pouring on needs to be smooth, because what I noticed about this tape is it makes a surface that the resin doesn't stick to, but because of the lines of the tape, it made lines on the resin. And so that surface wasn't totally smooth. So if you want a smooth resin bottom on your table, make sure that your tabletop or whatever you're pouring on is super smooth. And then you don't have to sand and polish it. Anyway, I poured 4 layers, and I waited 6 hours in between each layer, but not more than 48 hours, because if you wait longer than 48 hours, then you have to scratch the surface so the next layer will adhere to the layer below it. That is what the directions said for my resin that I used this time anyway. All resins are different apparently, and so just make sure you read the directions on your resin. I also used this expensive dye that's made for resins that I bought from Rockler. The guy said I only needed to use a little tiny bit, and so I tried to pour out a little tiny bit, but a bunch came out at one time. And that made it very, very, very blue and not as transparent as I wanted it to be at the end. But it mixed well. I also mixed up too much, so I grabbed another board I had that has a little knot in it, and I poured my remaining resin into that. I've also learned since doing this that you can use a lot of different things to color your resin, not just these dyes. However, I am skeptical whether they mix up very well, because I'll show you later my second attempt and how that looks. It all depends what you're aiming for. If you want it to be totally opaque, can't see through it, or if you want it to be transparent. I also heard that you can use a hair dryer or a heat gun to get your bubbles out. And so I tried a hair dryer. And what I noticed with the hair dryer is it really was too forceful, and it blew little waves into my resin. And this being my first time, I don't know if that's a bad thing or what. And I don't have a heat gun, so I used my breath, and that worked out really well. Though it made those bubbles pop way better than the hair dryer did. And for the small project, it was great, but if I was doing a big, huge project, I think it would make me pass out or something. So heat gun is definitely better. And then also I used a torch later, and that worked really well too. But I also have some questions about whether the hair dryer might have been better, and I'll get back to that too. And this is where my SD card failed. So I missed all of the footage of me cleaning it up and sanding and polishing. So I started a brand new project, and I made some changes that I learned from that first project. So with this one, I wanted to keep the bark. And I read some things about keeping bark and not keeping bark and all that stuff. And so I went to my air hose and I sprayed the bark off really, 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 really well, and then put it into the forms and started pouring, and little pieces came out. So what I learned about that is no matter how clean I think my bark is, there's always going to be little pieces that are going to come out once the resin gets on there. So the best thing to do is to apply resin to your bark first and let that set up, and then put your table together and pour your layers. This time I used a large piece of orange acrylic that we have that's really thin. I thought it would provide a perfectly smooth surface, and then I thought, well, maybe my new resin will stick to it because it's resin on resin, even though it's not scratched. Anyway, I ended up putting tape over the top of it just so that it wouldn't stick. So this is the difference that I did this time. I put that tape over the acrylic, and then I put my frame down. Then I just taped the edge where the frame met the acrylic. And that worked out really well, holding the acrylic in. A lot better than going inside. Then I used toggle clamps, and that worked really well. So much easier and better than the makeshift doohickey bobber I made that was really, really strange. Anyway, toggle clamps. And so I finally brought that torch in and tried it, and man, it really, really, really popped the bubbles, and it was great. But I also learned that you could scorch your resin, so I was careful not to scorch it, and I just popped the bubbles. Going back to my first project, the blue one, when I was all finished, it looked like there was dust in there. When you're looking through it, the transparency, I could see little flakes. I'm like, oh no, I got dust in there. So this time I made sure to cover my project as it was setting, and then in between layers, I blew it off really well with the compressed air. Well, the end result showed the same. It looked like dust in there. Then I learned about microbubbles. Microbubbles happen when your resin is too cold. So the shop here is between 60 and 65, and it says that your resin should be between 70 and 80. And so my question is, can I heat the resin up, mix it up, and then pour it And will it cause microbubbles if the air is less than 70? Or does the room need to be 70? I don't know. I have all these questions yet, and I don't know the answers to them. All I know is I have microbubbles, and I'm bummed about that. But if I just call it like Starry, Starry Night, then it's okay. And this is what I did to cover it up. But I'm thinking if it's not from dust, then this step isn't necessary. So for the second little table, I thought it would be really cool to have a brown tint to the resin. So I watched a couple videos by Peter Brown, and he used a whole bunch of different things to color his resin, but he always made it very, very opaque. And I'm looking for more transparent. But anyway, he used cocoa. And so I used some cocoa, and I made this really, really pretty brown color. When I mixed it up, I could see a couple little flakes of cocoa, and I thought, you know what, that might be kind of cool because it's a chocolate table. Oh, I want a chocolate table. Don't you want a chocolate table? But the microbubbles in there with the chocolate, I'll show you how that looked at the end when it all set up. But the cocoa, I love the idea of using the cocoa. A chocolate table, yeah. After it was all set up, I was a little concerned about putting it through the planer. And so I heard different opinions about whether it should go through the planer or not. Some say it doesn't matter, some say it does matter. But I was thinking, man, if it would go through the planer, then that would take away a lot of my work with the orbital sander and hand sanding and all that stuff. So I talked to husband about it, and he said, oh yeah, it can go through the planer. So I let him do that. And it worked just fine. So I made a big old pile of all the sandpapers I was going to use. So as I've been making this video, I've been watching other videos, and I'm learning more things that I should have in this video. Like right here when I sanded, that it should have been wet sanding. I watched a video by Peter Brown, and he took a chunk and he polished it, and great, it looked really great. And he wet sanded all of the steps. And so that's the first video that I've seen where somebody goes through the steps of how they polish. He did it real quick, and the video wasn't about that, but it helped me a lot. So that's what I need to do. I was starting at 60, going to 80, 100, 120, 180, 220, 320. Well, at 320, I switched over to some sandpaper because I didn't have any more hook and loop discs. So with the hand sanding, I did 320, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, and 1,500. Once I got past 220, I stopped going over all of the wood, and I just focused on the acrylic from there. The next step after that is the polishing phase, and I've noticed that nobody goes over this part. Everybody skips over it. And so I've had a really hard time trying to figure out how to do this part. I've tried 2 different polishing liquids. I've tried the Meguiar's Mirror Glaze polish and the Novice polishing system. And I haven't been able to get a great result from either one, but I know that I need a lot more practice, and this is the first time I've ever tried this, so yeah, it didn't turn out so good. But I did get a polisher, and that helped immensely, but still I haven't gotten that ultimate glassy look that I want. My concern is if I keep practicing with a poor technique, then my practice isn't doing any good. I need to be practicing a technique that's going to work. I just am not sure what that technique is. So my questions after working with resins so far, how do I avoid micro bubbles? And how do I make the polish look snazzy? So I have some ideas about the microbubbles first, that is making sure the resin is warm or making sure the room is warm or both. I also think about when I used the hairdryer and how it made the waves in the resin. Maybe that was making waves and making the bubbles come out better than just blowing the top of the resin. I don't know. Because I did pour some more resin on another project. It was just one pour. And I just left it, and there doesn't seem to be any bubbles in that one. However, it's not one where there's nothing on the backside, so you're looking through the resin. It's a resin, just over the top of a surface. So here's a little part of it for you to look at. So maybe there's bubbles in there and I just can't see it. I don't know. Questions? See, I have all these questions. So I'm going to show you those micro bubbles now. So here's the blue one with the little tiny bubbles in it. And this was 3 layers. And here is the chocolate table with the micro bubbles. And this was 4 layers. And then you can also see the cocoa, how it's not all the way blended in. And also the first level, I didn't put any cocoa in it, but I did on the next 3. So maybe that made a difference too. I don't know. I really don't know. And notice too the difference between the dye, how nice and incorporated it is versus the cocoa, how that's not incorporated. Maybe if the resin was warmer, the cocoa would have dissolved better or something. I don't know. So I'm going to wrap up everything that I learned that I do know answers to. I still will put some questions out there of what I don't know answers to. First, always follow the directions for your specific resin. Number 1, tape the bottom surface, then tape the outside of the frame. Number 2, use toggle clamps to hold down the wood. Number 3, use measuring cups for mixing or a scale for weighing. Number 4, make sure the resin is 70 degrees or warmer and maybe your room too. Again, number 5, follow the directions for your resin for thickness of pour, setting times, and second pour adhesion ability. Number 6, if you have bark on your live edge, make sure that you pour resin over that bark first and let it set up before you move on to pouring your layers. That's if you don't want any little bark floating in your resin. Number 7, you may not need to buy expensive dyes. However, avoid using water-based stuff because water and resin don't mix. It will make your resin either not set up or take a long time to set up if you use just a little bit of water. But whatever you choose, make sure that you mix it thoroughly. Also, you could watch a bunch of Peter Brown's videos because he tries all sorts of different things. Number 8, to get rid of those surface bubbles, use a torch or a heat gun or breathe on it. Hair dryer doesn't work so well, or maybe it does. And number 9, polishing. I have nothing to say here because I haven't figured it out yet. So that's what I learned with my first couple of times doing resin. I'm gonna keep on working on polishing, and if I figure out how to do it and make it look really good, then I surely will let you know. But for right now, I don't know. So I hope that helped somebody. And thanks for joining me, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye!